You're just living off Dad's money." My son said it so casually that for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The dining room went silent, except for the soft clink of silverware against china, even the grandfather. Clock in the hallway seemed louder. Suddenly, each tick landing like a bruise against my chest. Celeste didn't look surprised. That was the part that hurt the most. My daughter-in-law simply lifted her wine glass and took a delicate sip, her eyes fixed on the roasted chicken in front of her, as though nothing unusual had just happened. As though her husband hadn't reduced his 71-year-old mother to a burden in the middle of Sunday dinner. I looked at Grayson across the mahogany table. Conrad and I had bought 38 years earlier from a small antique shop in Vermont. Back then, we were young and broke and stupid enough to drive 6 hours through a snowstorm, just because I'd fallen in love with the table's carved oak legs. Conrad had laughed the whole drive home. "Anything for you, Meredith," he'd said. Now his chair sat empty, and our son was looking at me like I was some unwanted guest, living off leftovers. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap. My fingers trembled slightly, but I kept my voice calm. "What did you say?" Grayson Innes leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he was finally speaking hard truths. "I said Dad worked his whole life for the house, the investments, everything." He gestured vaguely around the dining room. "Meanwhile, you've just been living off it." A strange ringing filled my ears. Not because of the money, not even because of the cruelty, but because for one terrible second I saw it clearly. My son no longer saw me as his mother. He saw me as an expense. Celeste finally looked up then, her expression smooth and practiced. "Grayson doesn't mean it harshly, Meredith," she said gently. "We're just worried about your future." There it was. That polished tone she always used before saying something awful. The same voice she used 3 months earlier, when she suggested I should simplify my life by giving up the upstairs master bedroom, because the stairs were dangerous at my age. The same voice she used after Conrad's funeral, when she quietly removed half my dishes from the kitchen cabinets, because she claimed I didn't need so many anymore. Every insult from Celeste came wrapped in concern. That was what made her dangerous. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me what city you're watching from." Sometimes I still can't believe how far this story traveled after everything that happened. The dining room felt colder without Conrad. It had been only 9 days since we buried him. 9 days since I stood beside his grave in the freezing Connecticut rain while strangers handed me tissues and told me he was in a better place. 9 days since I came home to a house that no longer sounded alive. Even now, I could still smell his cedar wood cologne lingering faintly near the staircase some mornings. Sometimes I caught myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, before remembering there would never be footsteps again. Grief does strange things to silence. It stretches it, changes its shape, makes ordinary rooms feel haunted. I reached for my water glass carefully. My wedding ring tapped softly against the crystal. Celeste's eyes flickered toward it. I noticed everything lately." "Mom," Grayson said, with an impatient sigh, "you can't seriously expect things to stay exactly the same forever." I stared at him. This was the same boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, because he was afraid of lightning. The same boy who cried for an hour when his goldfish died in 3rd grade. The same boy Conrad once carried on his shoulders through Disney World because his little legs got tired. When had he become this man? Or maybe the worst question was this: had he always been this man underneath? "I never expected anything for free," I said quietly. Grayson rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "That's not what I mean." "Then explain it to me." Celeste stepped in before he could answer. "We just think this house is too much responsibility now. she said softly. It's almost 7,000 square feet, Meredith. The heating alone must cost a fortune. Our condo has plenty of room, Grayson added quickly. You'd be more comfortable there anyway. Comfortable. The word nearly made me smile. Their condo in downtown Stamford had 2 guest rooms. One already functioned as Celeste's yoga studio. The other barely fit a twin-sized bed. Conrad used to say people revealed themselves in tiny moments long before the big betrayals came. I finally understood what he meant. Because suddenly, all the small moments over the past few years started fitting together so inside my head like pieces of broken glass. The shortened phone calls. The holidays they canceled at the last minute. The way Celeste slowly took control of every family gathering, until I felt like a visitor in traditions I'd created. Even the funeral, especially the funeral. Celeste had insisted on handling most of the arrangements because I was too emotional. At the time, I'd been grateful. Now I wondered what else she'd been handling behind my back. I'm tired, I said softly, pushing my chair back from the table. Grayson exhaled sharply. Mom, don't do this. Do what? Act like we're attacking you. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my cream-colored cardigan. Outside, snow drifted silently across the backyard. Conrad loved so much. The garden lights cast pale gold shadows across the frozen lawn. Everything looked peaceful. That was the frightening thing about betrayal. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Sometimes it wore the face of your own child. I think, I said carefully, your father would be disappointed to hear this conversation. For the first time that evening, Grayson looked uncomfortable. Only for a second. Then Celeste placed her hand gently over his. And just like that, the guilt vanished from his face. I walked upstairs without another word. Behind me, I heard Celeste whisper something low to Grayson. Then both of them laughed softly. That sound followed me all the way to my bedroom. And standing alone in the dark room I once shared with Conrad, I realized something that chilled me far more than the winter outside. My son and his wife were already planning a future that no longer included me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the enormous king-sized bed Conrad and I had shared for nearly 40 years, staring at the faint shadows moving across the ceiling while the wind rattled softly against the bedroom windows. The left side of the bed remained untouched. I still couldn't bring myself to sleep there. Conrad had been gone only 9 days, yet the room already carried that strange stillness grief leaves behind. His reading glasses still rested on the walnut nightstand beside his favorite history book. A navy sweater hung neatly over the armchair near the fireplace because I still hadn't found the strength to move it. People think loss arrives all at once. It doesn't. It arrives in waves. A toothbrush left beside the sink. A coffee mug no one else uses. An empty chair at breakfast. Those are the things that truly break you. Around 3 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and wrapped myself in the pale gray robe Conrad bought me years ago during a trip to Maine. The house groaned softly beneath feet as I walked downstairs toward the kitchen. Vale House always sounded different at night. Older, lonelier. The kitchen still smelled faintly, like rosemary and roasted garlic from dinner. I stood there for a moment, under the dim lights, staring at the untouched pie, cooling beside the stove. I suddenly realized no one had asked if I'd eaten. Not Grayson, not Celeste. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat alone at the long farmhouse table near the windows, overlooking the backyard. Snow had started falling harder now, covering Conrad's garden in white. He loved that garden. Every spring, he planted tulips himself, because he said store-bought flowers had no soul. He used to spend hours outside trimming hedges while listening to old jazz records through a tiny portable radio. Last spring, Ivy helped him plant tomatoes. The memory tightened painfully inside my chest. Ivy, My granddaughter was the only person in the house who still looked at me the same way after Conrad died. The next morning, I woke to the sound of cabinet doors slamming downstairs. For one brief, foolish second, my heart jumped. Conrad. Then reality settled back over me like cold water. I dressed slowly and walked downstairs wearing a cream sweater and dark slacks. My joints ached from lack of sleep, and grief sat heavy behind my ribs like wet cement. Celeste stood in the kitchen, holding one of my old serving platters. "Well," she said brightly, though her smile still looked forced. "There you are." Something about her tone immediately made me uneasy. 3 cardboard boxes sat open across the kitchen island. "What's this?" I asked carefully. "Oh, I'm just helping organize a little," Celeste replied. The kitchen was getting overcrowded. I looked down into one of the boxes. Inside were several pieces of my wedding china. The china Conrad's mother gave us the week we got married. My stomach tightened. "I still use those."
Celeste gave a tiny laugh.
"Meredith, you barely entertain anymore. Barely entertain anymore, as if grief had already erased my entire life." She placed another serving bowl into the box without asking permission. I watched her for a long moment. Then something inside me shifted quietly. Not anger, something colder. Awareness. "You should ask before touching my things," I said calmly. Celeste blinked, clearly surprised by my tone. I was only trying to help. "That doesn't answer what I said." For a second, the pleasant masks slipped from her face, just for a second. Then Grayson walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, even though it wasn't yet 8 in the morning. "Morning," he muttered distractedly. He kissed Celeste on the cheek before finally glancing toward me. "Nobody mentioned last night. Not the comment, not the humiliation. Nothing. Families are strange that way. Sometimes they pretend silence erases cruelty." Grayson poured himself coffee while checking emails on his phone. "I talked to a realtor yesterday," he said casually. The room seemed to still. "A realtor," I repeated, "just to get an idea of what the market looks like right now." He shrugged. "Properties in Greenwich are selling fast." Celeste stayed very quiet suddenly. Too quiet. I looked between them carefully, and for the first time, I understood this conversation had probably started long before Conrad died. Maybe even while he was still alive. The thought hollowed something out inside me. "This house isn't for sale," I said. Grayson sighed heavily, like a tired businessman dealing with a difficult client. "Mom, you need to start thinking practically." Practically. Such a harmless word. People use words like that right before they take something from you. I folded my hands together to stop them from shaking. "This house belongs to me and your father." "Dad's gone," Grayson replied flatly. The cruelty of that sentence lingered in the kitchen long after he said it. Even Celeste looked uncomfortable for a moment. I stared at my son, really stared at him. The expensive watch, the polished shoes, the impatience in his face. When had ambition replaced kindness in him? Or had I simply refused to see it before? A sudden voice interrupted the silence. "Grandma?" I turned toward the doorway. Ivy stood there wearing oversized pajamas and fuzzy socks, her dark hair messy from sleep. She looked between all of us slowly. Then her eyes landed on the boxes. "What's going on?" "No reason to worry, sweetheart," Celeste answered quickly. But Ivy didn't look convinced. Teenagers notice more than adults think they do, especially the quiet ones. She walked over beside me and touched my arm gently. That tiny gesture nearly undid me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was kind, and kindness had started feeling rare inside this house. "I'm making pancakes," Ivy announced suddenly. "Grandma likes blueberry pancakes." Celeste opened her mouth, probably to object, but Ivy had already started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Grayson rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. The tension in the kitchen shifted slightly. Nothing could erase what I was beginning to understand. Conrad hadn't even been buried 2 weeks. And already, my son and his wife were reorganizing my life as though I were temporary. The house changed after that morning. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, like a stranger moving furniture 1 inch at a time, until suddenly nothing feels familiar anymore. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things disappearing. The silver candle holders Conrad bought during our anniversary trip to Charleston were gone from the dining room buffet. The framed family photo from Ivy's 10th birthday vanished from the hallway table. Even the throw blankets in the living room had been replaced with cold-looking white ones. Celeste claimed were more modern. Everywhere I looked, traces of me were quietly being erased. And somehow, that hurt worse than the shouting would have, because shouting at least acknowledges your existence. This felt different. This felt like preparation. 3 days after the dinner incident, I walked into the study and immediately stopped. Conrad's desk drawers were open. Not wide open, just enough for me to notice. My pulse quickened. I moved closer, carefully. My slippers barely making noise against the hardwood floor. At first glance, everything looked normal. The leather desk chair, the brass lamp, Conrad's fountain pens lined neatly beside a stack of unopened sympathy cards. But the bottom drawer was different. The folders inside had been rearranged. I knew because Conrad organized everything alphabetically. And now the tax documents sat behind old insurance papers. Someone had searched through them. I stood there very still. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Celeste. "Oh," she said lightly when she saw me. "I didn't realize you were in here." I closed the drawer slowly. "Were you looking for something?" Her expression never changed. I was actually searching for property tax records. Grayson thought it might help to organize the financial paperwork. Organize. Another harmless word people use before taking control. I studied her face carefully. Celeste always spoke calmly, but her eyes gave her away sometimes. There was impatience there now. A quiet irritation that I'd walked in before she finished whatever she was doing. "You could have asked me," I said. She folded her arms loosely. "We're all family, Meredith." Family. That word nearly broke my heart these days. Because families aren't supposed to feel like negotiations. Celeste smiled again, though it looked thinner this time. "We're only trying to help you manage things." I nodded slowly. Then I said something that made her blink. "I'm beginning to think you're trying to manage more than that." For 1 second, the room went completely still. I saw it then, not guilt. Calculation. Celeste recovered quickly, giving a small laugh. "You've been under a lot of stress lately." There it was again. That careful way she made every concern sound like emotional instability. I suddenly understood how dangerous people like her could be. Not because they scream, because they stay calm while making you question yourself. That afternoon, I drove into town alone, for the first time since Conrad's funeral. The February air was bitterly cold, and snow lined the sidewalks of Greenwich in gray piles. I stopped at a small coffee shop. Conrad used to love near the train station and ordered the same black coffee he drank every morning for 20 years. The young barista smiled kindly when she handed me the cup. "Have a nice day, Mom." Such a simple sentence. Yet after days inside that tense house, kindness almost startled me. I sat near the window, watching people hurry past in heavy winter coats, while my thoughts circled endlessly around the same question. When had Grayson and Celeste started planning all this? Before Conrad got sick? After? Or had they simply been waiting? The thought made me physically cold. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. It was Lenora Quinn. I hadn't spoken to my oldest friend properly since the funeral. "Meredith," she said the second I answered. "You sound exhausted." Something inside me nearly cracked at the sound of her voice. Not because she pitied me, because she noticed. "I'm fine," I lied automatically. Lenora snorted softly. You've said that exact sentence before every disaster since 1978. Despite myself, I smiled a little. She knew me too well. Tell me what's happening. So I did. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. The dinner comment. The realtor. The boxes. The study drawers. Lenora stayed quiet for several seconds after I finished. Then she asked one question. Has Alden Pierce contacted you yet? I frowned slightly. Conrad's attorney? Yes. No. Why? Another pause. Because Conrad came to see Alden 3 months before he died. My stomach tightened instantly. What are you talking about? I don't know details, Lenora admitted carefully. But Conrad mentioned wanting to make sure Meredith was protected. Those were his exact words. Protected. A strange chill moved through me. Outside the coffee shop window, snow drifted softly across the street while cars crawled through traffic with headlights glowing pale against the gray afternoon. Suddenly, I remembered something. 2 weeks before Conrad's heart attack, I'd walked into our bedroom unexpectedly and found him sitting alone in the armchair, beside the fireplace holding a sealed envelope. When he saw me, he'd smiled quickly and tucked it away. Just taking care of paperwork, he'd said. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Now my heart began beating faster. Maybe Conrad had known something before I did. Maybe he'd seen this coming long before I ever wanted to believe it myself. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized something important. I might not be nearly as powerless as Grayson and Celeste believed. That evening, I returned home just before sunset. Vale House stood at the end of the snow-covered driveway, looking beautiful and distant at the same time, its tall windows glowing softly against the dark winter sky. Conrad used to joke that the house looked too elegant to belong to normal people, but we had built our life there one careful step at a time. Not with inherited wealth, not with shortcuts, with sacrifice. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, my hand still wrapped around the paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. Lenora's words kept replaying in my head. Conrad wanted to make sure you were protected. Protected from what? Or from who? The front door opened before I reached it. Ivy stood there wearing a thick green sweater and wool socks, her dark braid hanging over one shoulder. While, she said softly. Something in her voice reminded me so much of Conrad that my chest tightened painfully. I stopped for coffee. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Mom and Dad were arguing. I looked at her carefully. About what? Of course they did. People always stop talking when the truth walks into the room. I followed Ivy inside slowly, removing my gloves while warm air wrapped around me. Somewhere upstairs, I heard muffled footsteps moving quickly across the floor. The house felt tense again, like everyone was waiting for something. Dinner that night was unusually quiet. Grayson barely looked up from his phone. Celeste picked at her salmon while pretending everything was perfectly normal. Ivy stayed close beside me, unusually silent herself. I noticed little things. Celeste and Grayson exchanging quick looks. The sudden silence whenever I entered a room. The way paperwork disappeared from counters the second I walked nearby. Once you begin seeing manipulation clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. After dinner, I went upstairs earlier than usual, not because I was tired, because I needed to think. Conrad's side of the closet still smelled faintly like sandalwood and starch. I stood there, touching the sleeve of one of his wool coats, remembering the winter we bought it in Boston during a freezing December trip years ago. Back then, Grayson was 12. He'd complained the entire weekend because Conrad made him visit museums instead of letting him stay in the hotel pool. Now, I would give anything to hear those complaints again. Grief is strange that way. It turns ordinary memories into treasures. I sat down slowly at my vanity table and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older these days, not because of wrinkles, because betrayal ages you differently than time does. I opened the small jewelry drawer beside me and carefully lifted out an old photograph hidden beneath several velvet boxes. Conrad and I stood beside each other in front of Vale House nearly 30 years earlier, both of us smiling into the summer sun while a 6-year-old Grayson sat on Conrad's shoulders, holding a melting ice cream cone. I traced Conrad's face gently with my thumb. "You were supposed to outlive me," I whispered. But Conrad always used to laugh whenever I said things like that. "Impossible," he'd reply. "You're the strong one, Meredith." At the time, I thought he was only being loving. Now I wondered if maybe he truly believed it. A sudden memory surfaced then. About a year before Conrad died, we attended a charity dinner in Stamford. Celeste had spent most of the evening charming wealthy guests, while Grayson followed her around looking exhausted. At one point, Conrad leaned toward me quietly. "She watches people the way investors watch stock prices." I'd laughed softly back then. Now the memory unsettled me, because Conrad noticed things long before he spoke about them. Another memory followed. 3 months ago. The night Conrad came home unusually quiet after meeting Alden Pierce. We'd been sitting in the library together while rain tapped softly against the Faubourg's windows. Conrad stared into the fireplace for a very long time before finally saying something that confused me at the time. "If anything ever changes around here," he said carefully, "promise me you won't let anyone pressure you into decisions too quickly." I looked up sharply now. The sentence echoed through my mind with frightening clarity. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly slid the photograph back into the drawer. "Come in." The door opened slowly. It was Ivy. She stepped inside carrying a folded blanket in her arms. "I thought you might be cold," she said quietly. I smiled faintly. "That's sweet of you." But she didn't leave. Instead, she lingered near the doorway looking nervous. "I heard Mom talking earlier," she admitted carefully. My stomach tightened immediately. "What did she say?" Ivy hesitated, then looked down at the floor. "She said this house could finally become useful, once everything was settled." The room suddenly felt colder. Useful. As if Vale House wasn't a home filled with decades of memories. As if Conrad's life could simply be converted into square footage and market value. I kept my face calm for Ivy's sake, but inside something hardened quietly. Not grief this time, not shock, understanding. Because for the first time, I realized this was never only about helping me. Grayson and Celeste weren't trying to protect my future. They were trying to secure theirs. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot Conrad was gone. Then I reached across the bed and touched cold sheets. Reality returned instantly. I stayed there listening to the quiet hum of the heating vents, while pale winter light slowly crept through the bedroom. Curtains. Snow still covered the backyard, untouched, except for a few bird tracks near the garden fence. Conrad built himself 20 years earlier. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside the house, something felt dangerously unstable. I dressed slowly and went downstairs earlier than usual, hoping for a few quiet moments alone. Instead, I stopped halfway down the staircase. Voices drifted from the kitchen. Grayson and Celeste, arguing, not loudly. That somehow made it worse. "I told you she's starting to notice," Grayson whispered sharply. Celeste lowered her voice, but I could still hear her. "Then stop panicking and let me handle it." I froze. The morning coffee smell drifting through the house suddenly turned bitter in my stomach. "She talked to someone yesterday," Grayson continued. "I know she did. Who? I don't know." A pause followed. Then Celeste spoke again, calm as ever. "It doesn't matter. Once the paperwork is finalized, none of this will matter anyway." Paperwork. My pulse quickened. I stood perfectly still near the staircase, while my heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What if she refuses?" Grayson asked quietly. Celeste gave a soft little laugh. She won't. The certainty in her voice chilled me more than the winter air outside. I stepped backward carefully before they could hear me, and returned upstairs as silently as possible. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger hiding inside my own home. An hour later, I came downstairs again, pretending I'd just woken up. Celeste stood by the stove making eggs, while Grayson scrolled through his phone at the kitchen island. Both of them looked up immediately, too quickly, like guilty people do. "Morning," Celeste said brightly. I noticed the folder near Grayson's elbow disappear almost instantly beneath a newspaper. Tiny movements reveal everything. "Morning," I replied calmly. I poured myself coffee slowly, acting as though I hadn't overheard a single word. That was when I finally understood something important. People show you more when they think you're weak. And right now, Grayson and Celeste believed grief had made me fragile. Good. Let them believe it. I sat quietly at the breakfast table, while snow drifted softly beyond the kitchen windows. Ivy came downstairs a few minutes later, carrying her school backpack. She looked exhausted. Teenagers wear stress differently than adults. Adults hide it behind smiles. Teenagers carry it openly in their eyes. "Morning, Grandma," she said softly before kissing my cheek. Celeste glanced up briefly. "You're leaving early again?" "I have debate practice." The answer came too fast. Another lie. Not a cruel lie. A protective one. I recognized the difference immediately. After Ivy left for school, Grayson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, we've been thinking." There it was again. We. Not him. Not our own thoughts. Always we. Celeste folded her hands neatly together. "We found a wonderful retirement community near Hartford," she said carefully. "It's private, beautiful, and has full medical staff available 24 hours a day." I stared at her. I was 71, not dying. Grayson slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me. Smiling elderly couples stared back from the cover beneath large silver letters that read, "Maple Grove Senior Living." The image made my chest ache. Not because of the place itself, because they'd already been researching it. Behind my back, "How long have you been discussing this?" I asked quietly. Grayson avoided my eyes. A while, meaning before Conrad died. Maybe even before he got sick. The realization settled heavily inside me. Celeste leaned forward slightly, her expression full of rehearsed concern. "You shouldn't have to manage such a large property alone anymore." I looked around the kitchen slowly. The white marble counters Conrad installed himself because I once admired them in a magazine. The coffee mugs hanging beneath the cabinets. The corner near the window where Ivy used to do homework while I baked pies on Sunday afternoons. This wasn't just property. This was my life, and they were discussing it like a business inconvenience. "I'm not leaving this house," I said calmly. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then Grayson sighed heavily. "Mom, you're being emotional." The words landed harder than he realized, because emotional is the word people use when they want to dismiss women politely, especially older women. I stood slowly, carrying my untouched coffee cup toward the sink. That was when the doorbell rang. All three of us looked up. Celeste frowned slightly. "Are you expecting someone?" "No." Grayson walked toward the front hallway while I remained still beside the sink. A few seconds later, I heard the front door open. Then silence. Long silence. Something changed in the air immediately. I turned toward the hallway just as Grayson reappeared. His face had gone pale. Behind him stood a tall, older man in a charcoal overcoat, holding a leather briefcase. Alden Pierce, Conrad's attorney. Alden removed his gloves slowly and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Vale," he said calmly. I apologize for arriving unannounced. My heart began beating faster. Beside me, Celeste suddenly looked very still. Too still. Alden glanced briefly toward Grayson and Celeste before returning his attention to me. There are several matters regarding Conrad's estate that need to be discussed privately. And in that moment, for the very first time since Conrad's funeral, I saw genuine fear enter my son's eyes. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Alden Pierce stepped into the house. Snow swirled softly behind him through the open doorway while cold air drifted across the marble floors of the foyer. Alden removed his coat with calm, careful movements, as though he hadn't just walked into the middle of a family quietly tearing itself apart. Grayson recovered first. "Alden," he said stiffly, "we weren't expecting you." I gathered that. Alden's voice carried the same steady authority I remembered from years earlier when he handled the sale of Conrad's business. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of composed expression that revealed absolutely nothing. People like Alden never wasted words. That was why Conrad trusted him. Celeste stepped forward smoothly, already rebuilding her polite mask. "Would you like coffee?" "No, thank you." His eyes moved briefly toward the brochure still sitting on the kitchen island. Maple Grove Senior Living. I watched him notice it, and I watched him understand. Alden turned toward me again. "Mrs. Vale, Conrad left instructions that certain matters were to be discussed directly with you, preferably in private." The room went very still. Grayson crossed his arms immediately. "There's no reason we can't all talk together." Alden looked at him calmly. "Actually, there is." The silence afterward felt heavy enough to crack glass. For the first time in days, I saw Grayson lose control of the conversation. Only slightly, but enough. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "My husband trusted Mr. Pierce," I said quietly. "So I'd like to hear what he has to say." Celeste smiled too quickly. "Of course. We all want what's best for Meredith." Again with that phrase, "what's best for Meredith," as though I were no longer capable of deciding that myself. Alden followed me into Conrad's study, while Grayson and Celeste remained behind in the kitchen. I could feel their eyes following us the entire way down the hallway. The moment the study door closed, the atmosphere changed completely. The room smelled faintly, like old leather, cedar wood, and Conrad's pipe tobacco. Morning light filtered softly across the bookshelves, while snow reflected pale silver against the windows. Alden placed his briefcase carefully on the desk. Then he looked at me for a long moment. "You've lost weight," he said gently. That nearly broke me more than sympathy would have. Because grief often hides itself inside practical observations. "I'm managing," I replied quietly. Alden gave a slight nod. Then his expression became more serious. "Conrad anticipated there could be pressure regarding the estate after his passing." My chest tightened instantly. Pressure. Such a careful word. "He came to see me several times over the last year," Alden continued, "mostly after family gatherings." A memory surfaced immediately. Conrad sitting unusually quiet after Christmas dinner. Conrad staring too long out the library windows after Grayson and Celeste left. Conrad asking strange questions about financial protections I hadn't understood at the time. "He noticed things," I whispered. "Yes," Alden said simply. "He did." He opened the leather briefcase slowly and removed a thick folder. My hands suddenly felt cold. "There are several documents you need to review personally," he explained. Conrad was very specific about timing. Specific about timing. Not after the funeral. Not immediately after his death now. As though Conrad somehow knew this exact moment would come. Alden slid the first document across the desk, toward me. I stared down at the familiar signature near the bottom. Conrad Vale. Even seeing his handwriting hurt. "He amended portions of the estate 6 months ago," Alden said carefully. I looked up sharply. "Amended?" Alden folded his hands. "The house, investment accounts, and majority ownership of remaining assets were transferred into a protected trust." For a second, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Then realization slowly settled over me. Vale House, the accounts, the investments. Protected.
Protected.
Protected from who? I asked softly. Alden hesitated, then answered honestly. Anyone attempting to pressure you into liquidation, forced relocation, or asset transfer. My pulse quickened painfully. Conrad knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to worry. Enough to act quietly behind the scenes. I looked down at the paperwork again, while emotions twisted heavily inside my chest. Grief. Grief. Shock. And beneath all of it, something else. Love. Even after death, Conrad was still trying to protect me. Alden reached into the briefcase once more and removed a sealed cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in Conrad's handwriting. Meredith, just that. Nothing else. My vision blurred instantly. He asked me to give this to you personally, Alden said softly. Only if you began feeling pressured by family members. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Outside the study, I heard faint footsteps pacing somewhere down the hallway. Grayson. Waiting, worried. I held the envelope carefully between trembling fingers. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it, because opening it meant accepting something final. Conrad truly knew he was leaving me behind. Alden stood quietly near the window while I slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter, folded neatly in half. I recognized Conrad's handwriting immediately. Steady, confident. Familiar enough to make my chest ache. I unfolded the paper slowly. Then I read the first sentence. And suddenly, I understood exactly why Grayson and Celeste were so desperate to control this house before I learned the truth. My hands trembled so badly, I had to steady the letter against Conrad's desk before I could continue reading. Meredith, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. The words blurred briefly through tears I refused to let fall. Outside the study windows, snow drifted silently across the backyard. Conrad loved more than any place in the world. For a moment, I could almost picture him standing near the garden fence in his old brown coat, hands buried in his pockets, smiling that quiet smile he saved only for me. Even now, he was still speaking to me, still trying to protect me. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Over the past 2 years, I have noticed changes in Grayson and Celeste that trouble me deeply. I prayed I was imagining them, but I no longer believe that is true. A cold heaviness settled inside my chest. Conrad noticed it too. The distance, the manipulation, the careful politeness hiding greed underneath. I continued reading slowly while Alden remained respectfully silent near the bookshelf. If there comes a time when anyone pressures you to leave Vale House, sell assets quickly, or surrender control of your finances, you are not obligated to agree to anything. I have arranged matters carefully so that no one can force decisions upon you. I closed my eyes briefly. For days, Grayson and Celeste had treated me like a confused old woman, standing in the way of their future. Meanwhile, Conrad had quietly built walls around everything they wanted. The realization was almost overwhelming. Then I reached the final paragraph, and my heart stopped. Most importantly, Meredith, please remember, this house was never my achievement alone. Every dollar I earned, every success people credit me for, was built beside you. Do not let anyone rewrite our life into a story where you were merely standing nearby. A tear finally slipped down my cheek, not because of the money, because Conrad saw me clearly, even at the very end. I folded the letter carefully, pressing trembling fingers against the paper as though somehow it still carried warmth from his hands. For several seconds, neither Alden nor I spoke. Then he cleared his throat gently. There's something else you should know. I looked up. The trust includes a clause preventing the sale of Vale House, unless approved directly by you. Relief moved through me, so suddenly it almost hurt. No one else can override it. Alden's expression remained calm. No. Outside the study door, footsteps moved again, slow but pacing. Grayson, waiting. Alden glanced briefly toward the hallway before lowering his voice. Conrad also requested that copies of certain financial records remain confidential unless necessary. My stomach tightened. What kind of records? Alden hesitated carefully. Large withdrawal attempts were made from one of Conrad's secondary investment accounts 3 months ago. I stared at him. What?
The transactions were blocked automatically.
Because Conrad had already placed restrictions on the account. The room suddenly felt colder. Who tried accessing it? Alden met my eyes directly. The requests originated from credentials connected to Grayson. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. Not because of the money. Because my son had apparently begun trying to reach Conrad's accounts before Conrad was even gone. A memory surfaced instantly. 3 months ago, Grayson, insisting Conrad should simplify certain investments because managing things was stressful at his age. At the time, it sounded practical. Now it sounded planned. I looked down at Conrad's letter again, and something painful shifted inside me. Parents spend their whole lives believing love automatically creates loyalty. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes love only creates opportunity for people willing to abuse it. A knock interrupted the silence. 3 soft taps. Celeste. "Everything all right in there?" she asked through the door, her voice perfectly pleasant. Alden's eyes flickered toward me. I wiped quickly beneath my eyes before answering. Yes. A pause followed. Then Celeste spoke again. "We were just wondering how much longer this might take. Not concern. Impatience. Always impatience." Alden waited until her footsteps faded before speaking again. "Mrs. Vale, there's no delicate way to say this." His voice softened slightly. Conrad believed pressure from family members would escalate quickly after his death. I gave a hollow little laugh. He was right. Yes, the simplicity of that answer somehow hurt more than sympathy would have. I stood slowly and walked toward the study windows, overlooking the frozen backyard. Conrad's gardening tools still rested near the shed, exactly where he left them in late autumn. Everything outside remained untouched. Inside the house, however, everything had already started changing. I finally turned back toward Alden. "What do Grayson and Celeste know?" "Very little," he answered. "Conrad insisted the full trust structure remain private until you chose otherwise." For the first time in days, I felt something besides grief moving quietly inside me. Not revenge. Something steadier, control. Downstairs, I suddenly heard Ivy's voice arriving home from school. Then Celeste answering too quickly. Then silence. Everyone in this house was pretending. Pretending to be concerned. Pretending to be patient. Pretending we were still a family. I looked once more at Conrad's letter resting in my hands. And standing there inside study we once shared during 40 years of marriage. I finally understood something clearly. Grayson and Celeste thought I was weak because I was grieving. What they didn't understand yet was this. Conrad had spent the last months of his life preparing me for exactly this moment. That night, I didn't go straight to bed. After Alden left, the entire atmosphere inside Vale House changed in a way none of us openly acknowledged. Grayson became quieter. Celeste became sweeter. That was how I knew they were nervous. People only become overly gentle when they're afraid they've lost control of the situation. Dinner passed in strained silence. Ivy talked about school for a while, trying bravely to fill the empty spaces between conversations. But even she eventually gave up. Every few minutes, I caught Grayson watching me. Not lovingly, carefully, as though trying to determine how much I knew. I kept my face calm. Conrad used to say, "Silence unsettles guilty people more than anger ever could." For the first time, I finally understood why. After dinner, I carried my tea upstairs and closed myself inside the bedroom. Snow tapped softly against the windows, while the old radiator hissed quietly beneath the curtains. Conrad's letter rested beside me on the bed. I had already read it 4 times. Each sentence felt different now. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to worry about me after he was gone. That realization broke my heart all over again. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Grandma, Ivy, come in." She stepped inside slowly, still wearing her oversized sweatshirt and fuzzy socks. In her hands was a small tray with sliced apples and peanut butter. "You barely ate dinner," she said quietly. Something about the gesture nearly undid me. Not because it was dramatic, because it reminded me there was still kindness somewhere inside this family. I smiled faintly. "You sound exactly like your grandfather." Her expression softened instantly. "I miss him. So do I." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The grief between generations feels different somehow. Older people mourn the life they built together. Younger people mourn the future they thought would always exist. Ivy sat carefully at the edge of the armchair near the fireplace. Then she lowered her voice. "Grandma, are Mom and Dad trying to make you leave?" Children always ask the question. Adults are too cowardly to say aloud. I considered lying. Instead, I answered honestly. "I think they believe they're helping themselves." Ivy looked down at her hands immediately. That told me enough. "You've heard things," I said softly. Her silence lasted too long. Then she nodded. "Last week, Mom told Dad they needed to move fast before lawyers complicated everything." A cold heaviness settled inside my stomach. Before lawyers complicated everything. As though Conrad's death had created some kind of countdown. Ivy swallowed hard before continuing. "They thought I was upstairs." Her voice became smaller. "Dad said once the house sold, everything would finally feel easier. Easier." I looked slowly around the bedroom Conrad and I had shared for decades besides. The framed photographs. The old books stacked beside the fireplace. The quilt Conrad's mother sewed by hand before we married. How could selling all this possibly make anything easier? Unless grief itself had become inconvenient to them. "I'm sorry," Ivy whispered suddenly. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "This isn't your fault." And it wasn't. Children should never be trapped between loyalty and conscience. Ivy hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else." My chest tightened instantly. "What is it?" She looked toward the closed bedroom door first, then lowered her voice even more. "Mom took Grandpa's office keys 2 days after the funeral." I stared at her. "What keys?" "The small brass ones he kept in the library drawer." My pulse quickened immediately. Conrad almost never misplaced those keys. They opened the old filing cabinet in his study, where he kept private business records and personal documents. "Did she say why?" Ivy shook her head, but I saw her and Dad in the study late one night. Her face tightened nervously. They looked upset. A memory surfaced instantly. The slightly open desk drawers. The missing paperwork. The whispers stopping whenever I entered rooms. I suddenly realized Grace and Celeste hadn't only been planning. They had been searching. Looking for something. Probably long before Alden arrived. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom window, staring out into the dark backyard. Snow covered Conrad's garden completely now. The stone pathway he built by hand had nearly disappeared beneath white drifts. Everything looked buried, hidden, but still there underneath, just like the truth. Behind me, Ivy spoke softly again. "Grandma?" "Yes!" I don't think Grandpa trusted Mom very much near the end. I closed my eyes briefly. Neither did I anymore. The frightened part was realizing Conrad may have understood that before I did. I turned back toward Ivy carefully. "Did your grandfather ever say anything to you directly?" She nodded slowly. "About a month ago." Her voice trembled slightly. "He told me families can survive almost anything except greed." The room fell silent. Conrad had always chosen his words carefully. If he said that to Ivy before he died, then he already knew what was happening inside this house. I suddenly understood why he protected everything so quietly. Not because he wanted conflict, because he knew conflict was already coming. And sitting there in the dim bedroom light beside my frightened granddaughter, I realized something else too. Grayson and Celeste still believed they were ahead of me. They had no idea Conrad had already changed the rules of the game before he died. 2 days later, Grayson suggested another family dinner. The moment he said it, I knew something was coming. People rarely gather everyone at the table unless they want something. The snowstorm outside had finally passed, leaving the trees around Vale House coated in thick white frost. By early evening, the entire property glowed beneath pale gold porch lights, while icy wind rattled softly against the windows. Inside, the dining room looked almost painfully beautiful. The long mahogany table shimmered beneath candlelight. Ivory plates sat perfectly arranged beside folded linen napkins. Conrad always loved formal dinners during winter because he said warmth felt more meaningful when the world outside looked cold. Tonight, however, the room felt staged. Like a performance pretending to be a family gathering. Celeste moved around the dining room carrying dishes with unusual cheerfulness. Too cheerful. Another bad sign. I noticed she had even worn one of her expensive cream-colored dresses, the kind she usually saved for charity events or business dinners. Grayson poured wine into everyone's glasses without asking first. Even mine. That alone felt strange. For nearly 2 weeks, they'd treated me like someone fragile and inconvenient. Now suddenly, they were trying very hard to appear caring. I sat quietly across from them, while Ivy pushed food around her plate in silence. Nobody mentioned Conrad. That hurt more than I expected. 40 years of marriage reduced to silence because grief slowed down the conversation they wanted to have. Finally, halfway through dinner, Grayson cleared his throat. "There's something we wanted to discuss." There it was. I set down my fork carefully. Celeste gave him a small, encouraging nod beneath the table, subtle enough that Ivy probably missed it. I didn't. Grayson folded his hands together like a businessman preparing a presentation. "Mom," he began carefully, "we all know things have been difficult lately." Difficult. Such a safe little word for devastation. I remained quiet, he continued. And obviously,
this house carries a lot of memories.
Carries. As though the memories belonged to the walls instead of the people still breathing inside them. Celeste leaned forward gently. "We've just been thinking about what would make the most sense moving forward. Again with we. Always we. Never my son alone anymore." I looked directly at Grayson. "What exactly are you proposing?" A brief flicker of discomfort crossed his face. Then he pushed forward anyway. "We think downsizing would be healthier for everyone." Healthier. Interesting how greed always learns the language of concern. I took a slow sip of water before answering. "And by everyone," I asked quietly, "you mean you." The silence afterward landed hard. Celeste recovered first. "That's unfair, Meredith." "No," I said calmly. "What's unfair is discussing my future like I'm not sitting at this table." Grayson exhaled sharply. "Nobody's attacking you." I almost smiled at that. People only say nobody's attacking you after they've already started. He reached into a folder beside his chair and slid several printed papers across the table toward me. Real estate estimates, property evaluations, projected sale values for Vale House. I stared at the numbers silently, while something cold settled deeper inside me. They'd already gone this far, without my permission, without even waiting for Conrad's headstone to be installed. Celeste's voice softened carefully. "With the current market, the house could sell for an extraordinary amount." There it was, finally. Not concern, not family, money. I looked up slowly. Is that what this is really about? Neither of them answered immediately. That was answer enough. Ivy suddenly spoke for the first time all evening. "We shouldn't sell Grandpa's house." The room immediately tightened. Celeste turned toward her daughter with forced patience. Sweetheart, adults are talking. I watched Ivy's face fall instantly, and something inside me hardened further. Conrad used to say, people reveal their true character by how quickly they silence inconvenient voices. Well, I said softly, I agree with Ivy. Grayson rubbed his forehead impatiently. Mom, you're thinking emotionally again. The sentence hung in the air for several seconds. Then, very calmly, I asked, do you know what your father told me once? Grayson looked startled. What? He said people become dangerous the moment they start treating love like a financial transaction. Celeste's expressions changed slightly. Just slightly. Enough for me to notice. Grayson leaned back heavily in his chair. This isn't about greed. Then why were you speaking to realtors before I even finished mourning my husband? That hit him harder than I expected. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely cornered. Celeste stepped in immediately. We were trying to plan responsibly. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question that changed the entire room. Did you know Conrad updated the estate 6 months ago? Absolute silence. Grayson's face lost color instantly. Beside him, Celeste became unnaturally still. And suddenly I knew. They didn't know about the trust. Not fully. Interesting. I folded my napkin calmly and placed it beside my plate. Alden Pierce visited recently, I continued quietly. Apparently Conrad anticipated certain problems. Nobody moved. Even Ivy stopped breathing for a second. Grayson finally found his voice. What problems? I looked directly at my son for a very long time before answering. The kind caused by people who confuse inheritance with entitlement. The room went dead silent. Outside, wind swept snow violently across the dark backyard windows. Inside, for the first time since Conrad died, the balance of power at that table had begun to shift. The candles continued burning softly in the center of the table, while tension settled over the room like smoke. Grayson stared at me in stunned silence, and beside him, Celeste's perfectly controlled expression had finally begun to crack around the edges. Not dramatically. People like Celeste never lose control dramatically. But I noticed the tiny things, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her wine glass, the quick glance she exchanged with Grayson when I mentioned the trust. Fear changes people's faces in subtle ways, especially when money is involved. I stood slowly and gathered my plate. I'm tired, I said calmly. No one tried to stop me. That alone told me enough. As I walked toward the kitchen, I could feel their eyes following me. Behind me, Ivy remained unusually quiet, almost as though she finally understood something irreversible had happened inside this family. And maybe she had. Some betrayals don't explode all at once. Sometimes they unfold slowly until one conversation changes how you see everyone forever. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it for a long moment. My hands were shaking, not because I was afraid anymore, because for the first time since Conrad died, I realized I wasn't powerless. The difference between grief and helplessness is important. One breaks your heart. The other steals your future, and Conrad had made sure nobody could steal mine. An hour later, a soft knock sounded at my bedroom door. Not Ivy this time, Grayson. I stayed silent for several seconds before answering. Come in. He stepped inside carefully, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My son suddenly looked older than 43. The confidence from dinner had faded, replaced by something uncertain and strained. I didn't know Dad changed anything, he said finally. I believed that part. At least partially. You were trying to sell this house anyway. His jaw tightened. We were trying to help. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because people cling hardest to lies they've repeated too often. I sat slowly in the armchair beside the fireplace, while Grayson remained standing near the door like a nervous teenager called into the principal's office. You spoke to realtors before your father was even buried, I said quietly. He looked away immediately. That wasn't my idea. There it was. The first crack. Not accountability. Deflection. Always easier to blame someone standing beside you than confront yourself. Celeste pushed for it, I asked. His silence answered before he did. She thinks practically, he muttered eventually. No, I replied softly. She thinks transactionally. That hit him harder than I expected. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Shame. Very brief, but real. Grayson sat down heavily across from me, rubbing both hands over his face. You don't understand the pressure we're under. Pressure. Interesting word. Everybody suddenly had pressure, except the widow sleeping alone in a half-empty bed. What pressure? I asked calmly. He hesitated. Then the truth finally started slipping out. The market's unstable. My bonuses dropped last year. We invested in a development project with Celeste's brother. And you need money. His face hardened instantly. It's not like that. But it was exactly like that. I suddenly remembered something Conrad once said after a business dinner years ago. Debt changes people quietly. Meredith. Pride keeps them smiling while panic eats them alive. At the time, I thought he was talking about clients. Now, I realized he may have been talking about our son. Grayson stood abruptly and began pacing near the windows. You have no idea how expensive life is now. I stared at him in disbelief. No idea? Conrad and I spent decades building a life from nothing. I remembered clipping grocery coupons while pregnant. I remembered balancing accounting books at midnight, after Grayson fell asleep. I remembered Conrad working 14-hour days until his hands shook from exhaustion. And now our son stood in front of me, talking, as though wealth had simply appeared magically around him. You think this house belongs to you because your father earned money, I said quietly. But you've forgotten who stood beside him while he built it. Grayson stopped pacing. I never said you did nothing. You implied it. Silence. Heavy silence. Then finally, almost too quietly to hear, he asked, what exactly did Dad put in the trust? There it was. Not grief, not guilt, money, control, fear. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering carefully. Enough to protect me. His shoulders tightened immediately. From me, the hurt in his voice almost weakened me. Almost. But then I remembered the realtor papers, the retirement brochures, the whispered conversations downstairs, while they thought I couldn't hear. Yes, I answered, honestly. I think your father worried about what grief might reveal in people. Grayson stared at me as though I'd slapped him. Then suddenly, the bedroom door opened without knocking. Celeste stepped inside. Her expression was calm. Too calm. I wondered where you went, she said softly to Grayson, but her eyes moved immediately toward me. Calculating, watching, measuring damage. She already knew the conversation hadn't gone the way she wanted. And standing there between my son and daughter-in-law, I realized something painful. Conrad had protected the estate. But he couldn't protect what greed had already done to our family. The next morning, Vale House felt unnaturally quiet, not peaceful, careful, like everyone inside the house had suddenly become aware of invisible cracks beneath the floorboards. I came downstairs just after 7 and found the kitchen empty, except for Ivy sitting at the island eating toast while scrolling through homework on her laptop. She looked up immediately when she saw me. You okay, Grandma? Children notice emotional weather faster than adults do. I smiled faintly. I will be. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false anymore either. I poured myself coffee, slowly, while pale winter sunlight spilled across the marble counters. The realtor brochures from the night before were gone. So was the retirement community packet. Interesting. People hide evidence once they realize the balance of power has changed. A few minutes later, Celeste entered the kitchen wearing workout clothes and an expression polished into perfect calm. Good morning, she said lightly. I noticed she avoided mentioning last night entirely. That told me she was regrouping. Manipulative people rarely attack directly after losing ground. They retreat first, recalculate. I took a slow sip of coffee. Morning. For several seconds, only the sound of Ivy typing filled the room. Then Celeste smiled softly. I think emotions got a little heightened during dinner. There it was, the attempt to reduce betrayal into misunderstanding. I looked directly at her. No, I said calmly. I think honesty finally did. Her smile flickered slightly. Only slightly. I know this has been difficult for you. Difficult. Another careful little word. People used soft language when they wanted to make cruel behavior sound reasonable. I set my coffee cup down gently. What exactly has been difficult for me, Celeste? She hesitated. The transition, losing Conrad, managing such a large estate alone. Interesting. Not once had she mentioned losing my husband as emotional pain, only as logistical inconvenience. Ivy slowly lowered her laptop screen, clearly pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Celeste folded her arms loosely. We're worried about you becoming isolated. I almost smiled at that. For weeks, they'd treated me like furniture, standing in the way of a real estate transaction. Now suddenly, they were concerned about isolation. I'm not isolated, I replied quietly. I'm grieving. That sentence landed harder than I expected, because grief sounds very different from weakness when spoken clearly. Before Celeste could answer, Grayson entered the kitchen. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually polished appearance had started slipping slightly around the edges. Good. Guilt should interrupt sleep. Morning, he muttered. Nobody answered immediately. The silence between us had something alive now, heavy, watching. Grayson poured coffee and finally looked toward me carefully. I've been thinking about what you said. I waited. About greed, about Dad. His voice sounded rougher than usual. For one brief moment, I saw the little boy he used to be hiding underneath the expensive suits and financial stress and pride. Then Celeste touched his arm gently, and he disappeared again. We all said things emotionally, she interrupted smoothly.
There it was. The rescue.
Every time Grayson drifted too close to accountability, Celeste redirected the conversation somewhere safer. I suddenly realized she had been managing him for years without him even noticing. No, I said quietly. I meant every word. The kitchen went still. I turned toward my son fully. Your father spent the final months of his life worried about me. Grayson's face tightened immediately. That's not fair. Isn't it? His jaw clenched. You're acting like I wanted him dead. The shock of that sentence hit the room like shattered glass. Even Ivy looked stunned. I stared at my son in disbelief. I never said that. But you're treating me like some kind of thief. I stood slowly. No, Grayson, I said calmly. Your behavior is doing that on its own. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. Ivy closed her laptop sharply and stood up. Grandpa would hate this. The pain in her voice silenced everyone instantly. He's been gone less than 2 weeks, and all anybody talks about is the house and money. Celeste's expression hardened immediately. Ivy, no, Ivy snapped suddenly, tears filling her eyes. You've been talking about selling this place since before the funeral. Absolute silence. Grayson looked horrified. Celeste went pale. And just like that, the final layer of pretending disappeared. Ivy looked toward me with trembling hands. I heard you, she whispered. Both of you. No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to deny anymore. I watched my son carefully then. Really watched him. The panic. The shame. The realization that even his daughter had begun seeing him differently. And for the first time since Conrad died, I understood something clearly. Grayson wasn't evil. That would have been easier. He was weak. Weak enough to let greed slowly replace loyalty. weak enough to confuse financial pressure with moral permission. Celeste finally broke the silence. We were trying to secure our future. There it was. The truth, not concerns for me, not practicality. Their future. I nodded slowly. And in the process, I said quietly, you nearly destroyed this family. Nobody argued with me this time. Because deep down, every person standing in that kitchen knew it was already true. The house felt different after that morning. Not healed, not peaceful, just honest. For the first time since Conrad died, nobody inside Vale House was pretending anymore. The silence between us no longer hid confusion. It hid consequences. I left for school in tears shortly after the argument in the kitchen. Grayson locked himself inside Conrad's study for nearly an hour. Celeste disappeared upstairs without another word. Her perfect composure finally cracked beyond repair, and I sat alone in the sunroom with a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside me. Snow melted slowly across the backyard, dripping from bare tree branches in soft, steady rhythms. Conrad always loved late winter because he said it reminded him that endings were temporary things. Even frozen ground softens eventually, he used to tell me. At the time, I thought he was talking about seasons. Now, I understood he was talking about people. Around noon, Grayson entered the sunroom quietly. For a moment, he simply stood there. My son suddenly looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone who had finally become aware of the damage he'd done. "Mom," he said softly. I looked up from the window, but didn't answer immediately. He sat across from me slowly, hands clasped tightly together. "I've been trying to justify everything in my head," he admitted. The money problems, the stress, the investment situation. He swallowed hard. But hearing Ivy this morning, his voice broke slightly. I realized I don't even recognize myself anymore. The honesty in his face hurt more than the anger ever had. Because underneath everything, he was still my child, just a lost one. "I never wanted your father's death to become about money," I said quietly. "I know." "No," I continued softly. "I don't think you do." He lowered his eyes instantly. For several seconds, only the ticking grandfather clock from the hallway filled the silence between us. Then Grayson whispered something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry." Not defensive, not rehearsed. The words settled heavily inside my chest. I thought they would heal something immediately. Instead, they simply made me sad, because apologies cannot return innocence once it's gone. "I believe you," I said gently. "But that doesn't erase what happened." He nodded slowly. "I know." Behind us, soft footsteps approached. Celeste. She stopped near the doorway, but didn't come fully inside. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. No polished smile. No carefully controlled warmth. Just a woman realizing she had finally pushed too far. "I owe you an apology too," she said quietly. I studied her face carefully, and strangely enough, I believed she meant it. At least partially. But remorse born from consequences feels very different from remorse born from conscience. "You treated me like an obstacle," I said calmly. Celeste looked down immediately. "We were scared. There it was again. Fear, money, pressure. People destroy relationships so easily, trying to protect lifestyles they can't actually afford." I looked out the windows toward Conrad's garden one last time before speaking. "Your father loved this house," I said softly to Grayson. "But he never cared about it because it was expensive." I paused. "He loved it because it was where his family lived." Grayson's eyes filled instantly. And suddenly, for the first time in weeks, he looked like Conrad's son again. Not completely, but enough to break my heart a little. A week later, I made my decision. I stayed at Vale House. Not because of the trust, not because of the money, because Conrad built that life beside me. And I finally understood I didn't need permission to remain part of it. Graysons and Celeste moved into a rental condo temporarily while sorting through their financial problems. Things between us remained fragile, but quieter now. More truthful. Sometimes distance is the only thing capable of saving what little love remains. Ivy still visited every weekend. Sometimes we baked pies together in the kitchen while old jazz records played softly through the house. Other times we simply sat in Conrad's garden beneath the maple trees, talking about school, life, and grief. Little by little, the house began feeling alive again. Different, but alive. One evening in early spring, I stood alone near the garden fence, watching sunset light spill across the backyard. Conrad loved so much. The air smelled like fresh earth and thawing grass. Tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the soil near the tulip beds he planted before he died. Even after the harshest winters, life still returns quietly. I finally understood that too. Conrad's final gift to me was never really the trust. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was the reminder that my life did not end simply because someone else stopped seeing my value. Families can survive grief. Sometimes they even survive betrayal. But only when someone finally chooses honesty over entitlement. I touched my wedding ring gently and looked toward the glowing windows of Vale House. Then I smiled softly to myself, because after everything that happened, I realized something important. I was never living off my husband's life. We built that life together. Losing Conrad taught me that grief reveals people more clearly than comfort ever does. The ones who truly love you will stand beside you when life becomes inconvenient, not only when the table is full and the house is warm. I also learned that growing older does not make a woman powerless, unless she begins believing she no longer deserves respect. And after everything that happened inside Vale House, I finally understood something my husband knew long before I did. Love built a family, but entitlement nearly destroyed it.